Hello and welcome back to December SAT 2024,
Yay!
the Hagwon
The last one of 2024.
2024. In
Yes.
review, we're going to recap what we saw, what our students saw in the December 2024 SAT. I'm June's Deanna, as always. And let's just get right into it. First of all, we always start with the comparison with a previous test administration, November. How does this chalk up?
December in general feels a little more difficult than November. That is the feeling we're getting from our students. Like with August as well, though we've talked about this before, August, December, and March are all very popular test days. So when we have a popular test day, there's just a lot more students taking it, and it's just a little more likely that certain things will feel a little more difficult when a lot of students are taking it, just because the sample size is a little different. But we are getting feedback that some students who took both November and December do feel that December was a slightly more challenging test than they remember last time to be.
Cool. Okay. Well, let's get right into December.
Yes.
First of all, the thing that I've been hearing is that the math module 2 was hard.
Math Module 2 is hard. Math Module 2 has consistently been difficult this year. I think every time we've checked in and we've talked about math, the consensus is that Module 2 is supposed to be hard. That's kind of the point of it, but it's markedly more difficult than maybe what students are expecting, especially if you're basing your feeling off of what you've seen on the 6 Blue Book practice tests.
And I think a lot of difficulty might be attributed to those last five-ish questions on module 2.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are saying that it's not necessarily the questions that are unsolvable.
Mhm.
It's the time crunch.
It is. So, last 5, I think the last 5 are pretty difficult questions. I really think it's the last 3 questions that are quite difficult. What we have been noticing on, the SAT exams is of the last 3 to 4 math questions, there'll usually be 2 or 3 questions that are very difficult concept-wise. There's usually, like, 2 geometry questions in there that are very, slightly more advanced versions of the same topics. And then there's going to be, it's usually one of the problem solving and data analysis questions. They'll sneak one of those in at the very end of the test. And it's not that those questions are difficult, but like June said, they're just really time consuming. You have Desmos, so you can do things like standard deviation calculations very quickly, but you're going to see a lot of questions that have like frequency tables that require you to put in a lot of legwork. There's not a lot of working around that you can do. You really do have to sit down and do the math. Use the Desmos calculator, definitely, but you do have to sit down and do the calculations. It's just going to eat up a lot of your time. So we are noticing that there are one of those questions at the very tail end, and the rest of those kind of last 4 or 5 questions are usually made of the most upper echelon difficulty geometry questions and advanced math questions.
I see circles traumatizing a lot of people.
Circles, yes, yes. We've talked about this before.
We have.
We have talked about this before. If you are solving any of the questions on the Blue Book practice test, so you're getting to Module 2 on the practice test, you're seeing the upper level difficulty circles, questions with intersecting lines, so angle questions, with like parallel lines, things like that, and complementary angles, things like that. And then any questions with triangles. You're going to see on the practice test the most basic version of that question. What I mean is they're going to give you like very clean pairs of intersecting lines. You might get a nice right triangle, and they're going to ask you a very simple question based on the trig rules, and you're going to get a circle question that really focuses on the essential things like arc angles, the areas the areas and degrees within a circle. So they're going to kind of stay within the most basic version of those geometry questions. What you're going to see on test day, remember we talked about how SAT is limited in the kind of topics they're allowed to ask questions on. So on their website, they have circles, triangles, angles on their website. They're not going to ask things outside of that list, but they're very welcome to ask more advanced versions of those questions on the official SAT. So the practice tests are there to just show you this is the breadth of knowledge, this is the breadth of topics we expect you to have covered at school, but it does not mean that it will show up on that level of difficulty on the official SAT. And why so many students are saying, oh my gosh, the math module 2 was so hard is because they're comparing it to the practice test that they took. So the best way to prepare for the geometry questions is actually to make sure you can do the geometry questions in your textbooks at school. So if you're taking geometry, if you're taking trig, if you're taking any kind of AP math course, look at those questions and see how they're asking geometry questions or any questions with figures, lines, angles in those textbooks. If you're able to do the upper level difficulty questions on there, you will be more than prepared for the official SAT. If you're just basing your understanding off of the Khan Academy questions or the Blue Book questions, you have the concepts down. So you'll be good for all of Module 1 and pretty much halfway through Module 2, but you'll have a real hard time figuring out what they're asking at the very tail end of those questions. So like we've talked about geometry, it will be difficult. It will continue to be difficult. That was also the case with the paper SAT. So if you know anybody who took the paper SAT, if you want to ask around, there were a lot of really tricky geometry questions on that exam as well. So SAT's just kind of come back to its root, what it knows how to do. But that's going to be a mainstay. It's not just December. So if you are taking a future test, if you think you took December, but you want to take another test moving forward, make sure you're getting very comfortable with geometry, with trig, and with any kind of problem-solving stats questions. Those are a mainstay. They're not going anywhere.
And this is also assuming you got the upper module.
Yeah,
If
sure.
module 2 is easy, I got bad news for you.
True, but if you truly practiced all the 6 Blue Book tests, you did the question bank, you did Khan Academy, and you did master those topics. What I mean is you have a very good understanding of those questions. You're not getting them correct just because you've seen them or done them before, but you really understand the steps you're supposed to take to solve those questions. You should be getting into the upper modules for reading, writing, or math. You should have no difficulty getting there. The trick is once you get there, you now want to break like 650 plus.
Yeah.
You're going to have to do a little more. You're going to need to do more advanced questions. Good news is you should find them at textbooks at school. Like really, that's what SAT is pulling from. It's those concepts that are being tested. So you have the resources to figure those out.
Well, speaking of breaking a certain score, then,
Sure.
what I see online a lot when it comes to the more difficult test administrations is the idea of a curve.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're getting very used to the idea of things being graded on a curve, especially based on their difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me, is the SAT graded on a curve?
Okay, so this is all conversations about a curve is truly speculative. Like we have to preface it by saying it's not just us. There's no SAT released information, official information about what the curve is, how you're being graded, how it changes exam to exam. We don't know. So, but we're making statements based off of what we see students get, what we see, how we see those change, and we've been doing this for a very long time. We've been doing this since before the digital SAT. So, kind of using our understanding of how SAT works. Yes, there is a curve in the sense that it's not a true raw to SAT conversion, and that if you get 3 questions wrong, regardless of what they are, this is your score. It doesn't really seem to work that way. We see lots of students, lots of our own students, walk away with kind of probably similar number of questions missed, but they could have very different breakdowns reading, writing, and math. So we do think that it's not all questions are equal, not all raw scores are equal. There is a curve. It also depends a little bit. Are you taking the international exam? Are you taking the exam in the US? Different versions of the test, slightly different curves. Now, I've read a lot of speculation online on different websites, different platforms in different communities where students are saying, or people who claim to be experts are saying the easier questions weigh this many points and the difficult questions, module 2 questions are worth how many points. And nobody knows for sure. Nobody knows for sure. We're not sure how much more you're penalized for missing a certain question type or a question type in Module 1 versus Module 2. SAT has not released any QAS services, question and answer services for the digital SAT. So no student has really been able to take the SAT, get their exam back, and then see what questions they've missed. So everything is speculative, but there is a curve. Will that help you? It is kind of a different question. It depends on where you are on the curve. It depends on what the curve looks like, where that's placed. It might depend on how many you missed per section, per module, question types you missed. We don't know. But is there a curve? Yes. Will that help you? We have no idea.
One of the unfortunate things about the digital SAT, it's advantage some test takers, but it's kind of a black box in how it's graded, how it's scored, how the
Right.
questions are made, even, which
Right.
brings me to my next question, which is there's talk of experimental questions,
Sure.
questions that look incredibly different
Right.
from those on the blue book, worded, phrased, even the answer choices seem to be in a different kind of template.
Mm,
Some people have been calling them experimental. Some people are
right.
saying they don't count.
Right.
What are they and do they count?
Well, so there's two things to talk about. One is there are experimental questions. They're also called pre-test questions on the digital SAT. So this is actually information released by College Board, so we know this is true. Each module on the SAT has 2 experimental questions. So what that means is there are 2 questions that are there to give SAT data on how students perform. Those questions are not there for you to get graded on. So that is absolutely true. And those questions, whether you get them correct or wrong, will not count towards your score.
So you're telling me if a question looks weird, I shouldn't answer?
That's exactly where I want to get into, which is the questions that are experimental may not be questions that look odd or feel difficult. So remember what I said earlier, which is the point of the questions is to give SAT data on student performance. And what they mean by that is they want to see if you look very closely at the rules for adaptive testing on SAT. One of the things they say is if a student gets a question wrong or if the student gets a question right and SAT thinks you might have guessed, they try to make speculations on whether they think that you guessed on a certain question or whether you actually knew that that was the correct answer and you solved that question. So SAT is really trying to gather all of this information, not just what happens if I give you a passage on something we've never talked about before, like hard coding or laws of coding, or very deep constitutional law that doesn't particularly show up on the SAT. How do students react? We could see versions like that, but there are versions of like, here's something that we could reliably test, but let me just slightly change the wording here, or let me make it slightly longer, or let me change up the order of the answer choices a little bit, and then see how that goes. That can be a version of experimental testing that SAT is doing. We don't know. So are there pretest questions? Yes. Do they count? No. Will you be able to tell which ones are the pretest questions? Probably not. And it's also, here's the thing I always say in class, if you have time during the module to be asking yourself, is this an experimental question? You're not properly focused on this test. You need to snap out of it, come back to the passage, read and solve, because you get a minute 15 per question, right? You got to come back to the test and work on this. You don't have the time of day to be thinking about all of those considerations.
And another thing that might make, well, you shouldn't weed out the pretest questions anyways, but another thing that might make them more difficult to identify is the fact that what we're seeing on the SAT, especially in comparison to the blue book questions, is that the questions are shifting and evolving a little bit, especially in the question stems and the answer choices.
Right.
Not in a way that changes the concept behind the question, but in a way that just changes the window dressing to maybe throw students off their game.
Right. So, if you remember, again, we're noticing that College Board has gotten very comfortable with the format of the digital SAT. So the first year that digital SAT was rolled out, I think they were really trying to stabilize, make sure that this was a stable test, it was a reliable test, and it definitely is now. And so they're kind of rolling out the bag of tricks that they had starting with the paper SAT, which is just changing up the wording of a question to throw students off. Just not to make it more difficult, but to make it a little more time consuming.
For example,
For example, what they may do is instead of calling something a main idea question, they might ask you to identify the main topic. We've talked about this in earlier exams this year and in React videos for earlier this year as well. But instead of saying what is the main idea, they might ask students to infer about what is the main point or main topic about a question. Now, because it has that word infer in it, some students being prompted to immediately treat that question like an inference question, which is a known question type on the reading section. But that question isn't an inference question; it's really a main idea question. So if you start reading the answer choices and you start going through them, you'll be able to get to the correct answer because the main idea question types are quite simple. But what the SAT has effectively done is made you spend more time figuring that out. So that's kind of, what they're trying to do, make you a little less efficient, make you a little less effective. So it's definitely happening. We're seeing that get rolled out on the digital SAT. We have seen that on the paper SAT. They have multiple versions of writing the same question types again and again. So you should expect yourself to require maybe a little more time to figure out what a question is really asking you to do. The best way to deal with that, or the best way to prepare for that, is to get very efficient at reading passages. This is something we've talked about before, and this is something I talk about a lot in my classes. But you have to get very clear, very deliberate, and very efficient at reading passages. So make sure you're spending less time on reading. You're required to spend less time reading passages, and you're really giving yourself a lot of time to look through answer choices and really compare two different answer choices so that you're making the most accurate choice. And I think moving forward, we might be able to talk about that more in depth on a later day, kind of skills for reading. If that's something that might be helpful, definitely let us know if that's something you're interested in having us talk more in depth about.
one thing that's always kind of a talking point issue on every single test administration is vocabulary.
Yes.
Always tough words pop up.
Yeah.
This is where we shamelessly plug our vocability tool, which we have a free edition of.
It's entirely free.
It's entirely free,
It's
actually.
entirely free. So, we spend a lot of time on like Reddit. We spend a lot of time online. We spend a lot of time with our own students talking to them about how to study, what to study, when to study, things like that. Something we have noticed a lot is students feeling like vocab is a lost cause, or compared to the amount of time you want to put in, you're not going to get a high return because there are only a couple vocab questions or words in context questions on the SAT. And the real, probability of you getting one with, 4 answer choices you have no idea about are slim. And, or the probability of you studying and memorizing this one word and that one word showing up on the SAT is slim. And so we have been noticing a lot of students foregoing studying vocab at all. Now, if your goal is to hit, somewhere in the 500s, maybe 600 at best on the reading writing, and or maybe you're really strapped for time, you're a senior, you have to take the SAT maybe twice this semester, and you have to be done with it. If you're in kind of that pool, kind of you have to make an exception. You may not study for vocab. If you are any other student, if you are any other student, you should absolutely be studying vocab. Not only will you see those words on the vocab section, you will see them in passages on the more difficult question types. You will see them in answer choices on the more difficult question type. It will make you a much more efficient and effective reader on the test in general. So absolutely you should be studying vocab. And it would be a shame not to prepare for vocab, especially now that we have winter coming up. And we'll talk about that again in a little bit. But give yourself the benefit of having studied some words. And we have vocability, which is our entire SAT vocab curriculum. It's close to 1,200 words. They're broken up into 20 different chapters. All 20 chapters, every single word is absolutely free on the website. Not only are all of the flashcards entirely free, all of the flashcards are also on Quizlet. All the links to the Quizlet are on our website. You and all of the Quizlet resources are absolutely open to you. But also the chapters come with SAT style words in context questions using the vocabulary words. So not only can you study the words for free, but you can check to make sure you've learned them in an SAT style question for free as well. Not only are they free, you don't even need to make an account. You just need to go to the site. June will link it down below, the link to the vocabulary page. All of the words are up there. All of the questions are up there. The flashcards are up there. You can use it on your computer, on your iPad, on your phone. It's super accessible, and it's up there so that you can get a head start on studying for vocab, making sure you're really best prepared for test day, because we have seen every single test we've reacted to this year, there are 2 to 3 words and everyone's like, what did it mean? Or where is it? And we're like, well, we had it. It was on our deck.
Yeah.
And it's gonna happen again and again and again. There's no reason that March, May, June, August of next year, you won't see the same case of having 2 or 3 questions with really difficult words that are just hard, that you just have to sit down and memorize. It's gonna come up. We know it's going to come up. And sure, we don't know exactly which word is going to be on that test, but we know at least a few of the ones on our vocabulary check are going to be there for you next spring semester. So take advantage of the resource. We've made it. It's made by teachers. We've tried to make it as accessible and as helpful as we think a vocab resource should be. It's open to everybody. It's available to everybody. So please check it out. And give yourself the advantage of being prepared for vocab on testing.
Ameliorate your vocabulary.
Yes,
Augment it.
ameliorate.
We will help you propagate your lexicon. Those are all words that came up.
Those are all, yes.
And all words that we know.
And all words on vocabulary.
Start early, start now, start free. No account needed. First link below.
Absolutely.
Please check it out.
Please check it out.
Okay. Yeah. One more thing about December.
Yes.
Or just things that I've seen from test takers in the Reddit threads. A lot of them talk about how they are multiple time test takers. They're repeat test takers. And they see similar topics pop up.
Sure.
Even the same questions, maybe.
Sure.
Or test takers that have heard about certain questions for a long time and suddenly they pop up.
Right.
I can't help but think, might that be an advantage, knowing about the subject material ahead of time, or even getting to have another go at the same question?
There's a couple different layers to that question. The first is that it is not an advantage big enough for you to take the SAT multiple times, just so that you can see a question that is maybe a little more familiar, so that you think you might get a question that is a little more familiar looking to you.
And to be clear, that'd have to be like 3+ at a minimum.
You would have to be taking it like maybe 4 or 5 times to be seeing kind of that same version of that question.
Which we do not recommend.
Which you shouldn't be doing, which really is a waste of your money. It's a waste of your time. It stresses you out. Like, I have students all the time who come, they sign up for a test without talking to me about it, which is fine. You're allowed to take a test whenever you'd like. I'd rather it be when you're ready, but you're free to take it whenever you'd like. But they didn't prepare for it. They sign up for it. They get really stressed out like the week or 2 before it. They try to cram for it, and then they take it and it goes awful, so they have to cancel it. So you got stressed. You weren't able to spend that time doing other stuff like schoolwork or sleeping or doing something actually enjoyable with your time. You didn't get a score. Now you're just more anxious about the next exam because the last one didn't go so well. So taking the SAT multiple times for the heck of it is really not helpful. And I know that a lot of the policies around like score choice in sending scores to colleges has changed. That does not change my opinion in that you should not be taking the SAT more than 3 times. It is not good for you, and we do not have a good track record at any school, any kind of institution of students taking it 5-6 times and getting the dream score they want. It actually is the inverse. Most students who really study properly the first or second time round get the score they want within those 2 to 3 times. Students who take it 6 times end up compromising with their score. So don't do it. It's not helpful. Having said that, let's talk back to this concept of seeing questions you've seen again.
Yeah.
We know that this is true. We know that SAT is making versions of similar questions. So maybe they have a passage written and they're kind of purposing that the logic in that passage, but they're just changing the topic. They might be changing the city they're talking about, or quality they're talking about, or a time period, but it will be pretty much the same flow of the passage, and a very similar answer choice. So we know this is true. We have seen it before. Now, having said that, from a student's point of view, even if you see a question you saw on a test, maybe you took March 2024 and then you took November or December 2024, you might see a similar question with that much time difference. Will that help you? Probably not. And there's two reasons for that. One, you have no idea how you did it the first time. So you may remember what you selected as the correct answer the first time. You have no reason to believe that that's actually the correct answer. So there's no way we know for sure. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and this I know as an absolute fact because I teach students day in and day out, is if you see questions you've seen before, you become sloppier at that question. Now, without fail, students are like this. You start reading the first two lines, you recognize a couple of things, and you go, oh, I saw this question before. And you start to read faster, and you start to read in a more reckless fashion. And you understand the passage in a way that it's not supposed to be, or you end up falling into the traps that SAT has kind of laid out for you. Especially this is true on the reading section. So if you start to do that, you get sloppier, you get a little more reckless, you get quicker. You end up choosing an answer you otherwise would not have, and it actually will end up hurting you. So my advice is, don't try to take the SAT many times so that you get very used to it or you see questions you might recognize. That's just a bad strategy. Even if you do see a question that is very familiar to you, do not let yourself skip things and come make predetermined kind of conclusions on what the passage is talking about and go, oh, yeah, I remember this question, or I remember it being about this, and go straight to the answer choices to make a decision. Make sure you're using the same skill set to read and navigate that passage as any other, and same goes for the answer choices. Remember, especially for reading questions, the answer choices have lots of traps in them, and the difference between a correct answer and an incorrect answer may be a single word, right? Using more or most, or better or best, those are two entirely different statements. So, because of that, you may pick an incorrect answer. So, don't let yourself skimp out on this question because it's easily recognized.
And I remember you talking to me about even familiarity of subject material could work against you.
Right.
If you can love the stars, you can love astronomy, and a question might be on planets.
Right.
But the answer choices in the question itself might have nothing to do with that. It's more
Right.
about how you read it.
Right. You have to keep in mind, and it works both ways, right? So one thing I tell students who have like an aversion to science, they hate it. At school, they don't take any science classes other than the general requirements. I tell them, well, at the end of the day, this test is a reading test. So it's not based on scientific knowledge, and it's not based on how comfortable you are with the scientific information. Your only job is to read the words, follow the logic of the writing, and then pick an answer choice that works based off of what the passage has told you. And so that is sometimes an advantage for people who are not well versed in a certain topic. The opposite is also true, which is if you are very well versed in a topic, you may start to bringing outside knowledge, which is factually correct, but may be completely irrelevant to what the passage is talking about. And you might see answer choices that seem plausible, that might seem logical based on your outside knowledge, but using just the information in the text, we can't arrive at that answer. So never let your understanding of a topic hinder you in that way. Just you need to zone in completely on what the passage is saying and what you're being offered as information there. Anything outside of the passage should not be brought in to answer that question. Nothing.
Right. So the last thing I want to talk about today is the next SAT is
Yes.
not January.
Nope.
It's not February.
Nope.
It's in March.
It's in March.
It's 3 months away. There's a whole gap in between that time where you have winter break,
Right.
where your school starts again for your winter semester.
Right.
Some people here, I'm sure, are not going to be as happy with their December score. I've already registered for March anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So for them, they have these around 3-ish months to prepare,
Sure.
to think. What do you recommend students to do in this time?
Sure. I think it's actually a blessing in disguise for you to be forced to have a couple of months of not being able to take a test. And because we have this forced hiatus, the first thing I'm going to say is do not begin by burning through the practice tests. Do not begin by burning through the 6 Bluebook practice tests, especially if you've taken a couple of those already in preparation for a previous SAT exam. Now, the last thing you should do, so in terms of kind of sequence or timeline, the last thing you should do is taking the Bluebook practice tests before the exam. So if you're taking the March exam, I would recommend you begin taking the Bluebook practice test in February, maybe even mid-February, if you only have a couple of those left. So begin by taking a diagnostic. Now, I just said don't take the Blue Book practice test. What do? We have a free diagnostic on our website. Don't burn out the Blue Book practice test. Save those for that last bit of studying you need to do before the SAT. Save them, keep them fresh so that you can really make sure you're understanding concepts properly and testing yourself with those. Instead, you can use our diagnostic practice test. There are so many other websites that offer similar services that all have free diagnostics. You're very welcome to, use those as a first starting off point. So use a diagnostic, any free diagnostic or paid, whatever you'd like, right at the beginning of winter vacation. So start off, if you know you're going to study throughout winter vacation, take a diagnostic and have that score written down somewhere. And also have the top 3 question types you're missing in each of the sections based on your diagnostic. What I mean by that is if you miss a lot, if you take the diagnostic, write down the question types you missed most of in reading, writing, and math. Now, obviously, math, there are only 4 areas, so you're not going to write algebra, advanced math, and geometry, but instead you might write something like trigonometry rules or identities. You might write circle angles, something a little more specific. Write the top 3 areas you're missing in math. In reading and writing, it should be question types. If you're missing a writing question, the grammar rule that you were getting tested on, write those top 3 down and start with a diagnostic. Then I would go on to Khan Academy. And if you're studying over winter break, the winter break is a great time to do 2 things. One, we talked about vocab, right? You have a forced hiatus, sit down, memorize vocab, do 20 words every day for a month. If you do 21, if you have, like a 3-week winter vacation, that's good 400, 500 words. 20 words a day is super easy. If you can commit to doing like 50, that's going to be close to a little over 1,000. That's most or all of our vocabulary curriculum, which should put you in a wonderful place for March SAT. So one, definitely invest time in vocab. 2, you should be going back to concepts. If during winter break, if you're studying, start with concepts. What do I mean by starting with concepts? It means 1, you make sure you actually understand the math concepts on Khan Academy. So you're not just memorizing how to solve this question based on the practice test question, but you actually understand the math that's happening there. You understand how to use Desmos to solve these questions. The concept of the math is very familiar to you. Make sure you get that for all the questions on Khan Academy, every single one of them. And when I say master them, it's not jump in, take one of the quizzes. You do the 5 practice questions on Khan Academy. You get like 3 or 4 of them correct. And then you're like, okay, I got that concept, move on. No, you should stay on there until you can get all 5 correct consistently for all the concepts. For reading, writing, you want to start with writing concepts. So you're going back to the grammar rules. Again, Khan Academy has written grammar rules articles, so they're going to explain the grammar concepts that are being tested and the rules. Make sure you read, understand, and memorize grammar rules. Grammar is just like math. the basic formulas, the basic rules, you have to memorize them. So make sure you're doing that. Start off with that. That should take you 2 weeks. If that's not taking you 2 weeks, you didn't do it properly. Go back and do it in a way that's going to take you 2 weeks. Make sure you spend the time, because if you start cutting corners there, you're not going to get the score you want, and you have 3 months until the next test. There's no need to rush right now. There's no need to cut corners right now. Go back to the basics, really study vocab, really study the math. And if you are someone who's struggling with fiction, lots of students have become very comfortable with the kind of science or social science passages on the reading section, because they're just a little more plain and easier to kind of, maybe the topic is difficult, but they're a little easier to navigate. And a lot of students get really stuck on the fiction pieces. If this is you, great news is we have a backlog of paper SAT. So if you go online, you'll be able to find a lot of the old paper SATs as PDF. The wonderful thing about paper SAT is that the reading section on paper SAT would always begin with a single fiction passage. Every single one of them has a fiction passage. They're longer, they're 80 lines, but they have 10 questions attached to them. So if you're struggling at all with navigating fiction, so that's going to be novels, plays, short stories, poetry, if you're struggling with any of those, go back to the paper SAT material and work on those fiction. Make sure you can answer those questions. You can become very comfortable reading with texts from all of the different generations, all of the different centuries, and that should help you a lot. Now that's going to be winter break. So if most of you guys probably have like a 3-week long winter break, that's what you should be doing for those 3 weeks. Now, once you're done with those 3 weeks, that's when you can start taking practice tests. So remember to take the practice test. And you remember, I've talked about this before, but taking the practice test is not the studying. The practice test is the testing. The studying is after. The studying is the review after. So take a practice test. Don't take one every day. I would take one, if you start taking them in January, I would take one a week, one maybe every other week. Take the test and then review. Reviewing means being very meticulous in what are the questions you're missing. Is there a pattern in the questions you're missing? Are you missing certain types of passages? Are you missing certain question types? Are you having more difficulty in a single section on the test? Paying attention to that. And the biggest question you need to figure out is, okay, why did I end up at the incorrect answer choice, right? If you go back to the Blue Book explanations, they're going to explain to you why the correct answer is correct. Okay, if you do that enough times, you should have no problem understanding and learning why the correct answer is correct. However, you personally need to figure out why you ended up at the incorrect answer you chose based on the passage that you were given. So go back, give yourself time to think, okay, well, I read this in this passage and I understood it to be that. And that's why I thought that meant this in this answer choice. And that's why I picked it. And those are that's the review that you're going to have to do to make sure you don't do that the next time. So that's where I would spend most of my energy throughout January, and then continue into February. But if you have taken many tests already, I would only take one maybe every other week. January and February, kind of sprinkle those across the 2 months. Make sure to give yourself the time and energy to really review. Spend more time reviewing than you did taking the actual practices. I know that's the reverse for many students. Don't do that. Review longer than it takes you to take the test. And you should be in great shape for March, I think. Yeah.
My hands are freezing, which means it's time to close it out.
Yeah.
For those who took December SAT,
Good job. It's
You've done
over.
it. Focus on school. Finish strong. GPA is another part of the equation when it comes to colleges.
Yep.
And then you have winter break. You'll know your score by then. You'll know what you need to do. If you're taking March, 2 things. Three things. First, listen to what Deanna said.
Yes.
Take it to heart. Listen to it like, those Buddhist mantras.
Mantras. Yeah.
2, check out our vocabulary tool.
Yeah.
Please.
Yes.
And 3, we'll see you then.
Yep.
Bye.